What's up, guys? Today we're going to be going through some mechanical stuff, a little bit of differences by guys' body types, the way they move, what things make certain guys move well and make others move poorly, and kind of diving down that route. Kind of going through why you shouldn't just look at a certain cookie cutter approach to mechanics and having everybody move the same way. So before we start, I just kind of want to define what mechanics is. The way I would define it is it's the patterns of movement your body uses to organize itself to achieve a task, right? So that involves any task that you do, right? Whether that's throwing a baseball, whether it's picking up an object off the ground, whether it's walking, all of those have certain patterns that your body finds to try to be as efficient as it can to accomplish that task, right? So your task as a pitcher is to throw the ball hard and through a small window, right? The strike zone. So your body is going to organize itself to produce a lot of force into the ball and produce that force in a specific direction to try to get it where it needs to go, right? So how you go about organizing yourself to do that is going to be different from one of your teammates or a big leaguer or any of those things, right? So how you find your way of moving is going to be different from everybody else. And there's kind of some groupings, some ways we can split up guys that move in certain ways. Again, everybody's going to be a little bit differently or going to move a little bit differently, but in general, people are going to move in similar patterns a lot of times, right? So some of the things I'm going to go over here are going to be linear versus rotational movers, loose versus tight movers, external rotation bias and internal rotation bias, specifically in the hips, and then short versus long levers. All of these things are going to affect how you move, how you apply force, and are going to change the way that you should look at how you're going to make mechanical adjustments. So starting off with linear movers, right? What these guys are, a lot of times you can tell this just by looking at a guy once you kind of have this information, whether they're moving in a more linear or rotational fashion. But linear movers in general are going to rely more on getting momentum down the mound and producing a lot of ground force. And because of that, they're typically going to need a strong lead leg block in order to throw hard, right? They're basically generating a ton of energy down the mound, stopping all of it with that lead leg and transferring a bunch of energy then up the chain. But it's in more of a like a collision with the ground, right? They're putting the car in a very fast acceleration and then slamming on the brakes and generating force that way, right? So typically these guys aren't going to get as much hip shoulder separation as like a rotational mover. They're not going to get in a ton of deep ranges of motion a lot of the times. But they are typically very athletic guys. They're very bouncy. They can jump, they can sprint, they're very explosive. So some examples of linear movers are Justin Verlander. He's probably my favorite example. He's very unique in the way he moves. Another one would be Shane McClanahan for the Rays. And then a recent draft pick, Chase Burns. All these guys have been up to 100 miles an hour, but they move in very linear fashions, right? So if you were to look at it from a very cookie cutter point of view and be like, these guys don't get a ton of hip shoulder separation. They're not rotating very much, they're not going to throw hard. That obviously doesn't make sense because these guys all throw gas. Now, for rotational movers, it's going to be a little bit different of a move. They're going to typically be a shorter stride and less extension. And the reason for that is they're not relying on that force like pushing down the mound as much, right? They're more generating rotational force. And a lot of times that can lead to shorter extension and not necessarily reaching out towards the plate to throw, but instead trying to just rotate their hips and torso as fast as they can, right? So because of that, again, they're not going to get as much speed down the mound. A lot of times they're going to not move as fast linearly to move faster rotationally, right? And what they're going to rely on for their velo is summation of speed. So that's going to be the hips going first, then the torso going a little bit faster than that, and the arm going a little bit faster than that, right? And each of those parts of the chain, adding a little bit extra velo in a rotational manner is going to put a lot of force then into the ball, right? So as far as linear versus rotational, typically most pitchers, especially high-level pitchers, move more rotationally than they do linearly, but it's a spectrum. So everybody's going to be have a little bit of a linear move and a little bit of a rotational move, but in general, guys typically are going to lean more rotational. So some more examples from the big leagues of these guys is going to be Luis Castillo, Camilo Doval for the Giants, and then Brusdar Graterol, right? These guys are very rotational. One thing to note too, they're all three of those guys are a little bit lower slot guys. Sometimes rotational guys are going to be it's going to be easier for them to go lower slot so they can really accelerate that arm. But those three examples, again, guys that throw 100 miles an hour, but they do it in a very different fashion than the linear guys. Now, moving on to loose movers. So this is going to be a little bit less of actually the delivery, but instead of it's how your body actually operates. So loose movers typically have a better range of motion, right? They're kind of those hypermobile guys. They're able to get into deep positions, and because of that, they're able to accelerate certain parts of the chain faster than other people, right? So these loose movers are typically going to create more separation between each segment of the delivery, right? So that would be hip shoulder separation or hip torso separation and then torso and arm separation. And because of that, now they're going to basically be able to stretch their body and stretch their rubber band longer before they release, which is going to generate more force, right? So these guys typically also have longer levers, the guys that throw hard, right? Um, but there are examples of guys that are smaller, but they are very bendy and loose, and they still are able to throw hard. But those guys typically have more explosiveness, more horsepower, but in general, in order to throw hard as a loose mover, you need less horsepower than somebody who's a tight mover because you're able to generate more force just from having a long stretch. So you don't need to actually produce that force like muscularly or like concentrically. So examples of this, Jacob deGrom, Aroldis Chapman, Dustin May. These guys are all very loose movers. They get into very deep ranges of motion. And because of that, they're able to send a lot of energy up the chain to each segment through stretching that rubber band. And again, all these guys throw 100 miles an hour. Now, tight movers. Tight movers is something that is very, I guess, controversial. A lot of times, pitching coaches are going to try to train you to get more mobile in certain positions, try to get into these deeper positions when you physically are not able to do it because you are more of a tight mover. And when that happens, it's going to be very difficult for you to throw hard because you're going to throw off the timing of your sequencing. So that's the most important part for these tight movers is the timing of your sequencing and specifically like, for example, hip shoulder separation. It's not about how much you get, but it's about the timing of it and optimizing the explosiveness and that summation of speed that I was talking about before, right? So these tight movers are typically stronger guys and they're very twitchy, right? So they have a lot of explosive power. And when they time up that explosive power and are able to efficiently transfer it to the next part of the chain each time, now they're sending a lot of force into the ball, right? So another thing to note with these guys too, overload balls are typically their friend. They throw overload balls better than underload balls typically. And this is because they are those stronger guys. They're able to they're relying less on getting into very deep positions. So they don't necessarily need to do a ton of stabilization at end range of motion, which is something that loose movers struggle with when they throw the overload balls. So Brusdar Graterol is another example. I used him. He's a rotational guy and he's a tight mover. So if you look at him, he's not going to get into crazy positions on the mound, but he's really strong. He sequences well, and that timing allows him to sit 99, 100 miles an hour. Mason Miller for the A's is another example of this. Throws 100 to 102, but doesn't get into any crazy positions. Joan Duran, same thing too. These are three guys that are elite relievers in the big leagues, and probably none of them are very mobile in general. Getting into hip bias. So guys that have external rotation bias, this means that they are able to turn their hip outwards, or a lot of times it's confusing because their foot may actually come inwards when they do this. And that is, they have much more range of motion externally rotating the hip than they do internally rotating the hip, right? And because of that, when they load and they drop into their back hip, they're able to hold a more vertical shin position, right? And this is something that a lot of coaches will harp on, and I'll get to it with the internal rotation guys, but um, these external rotation guys are going to be able to do that and still hold that tension in their back hip, and they're going to be able to really generate power with that vertical shin as they move down the mound. And they're typically not going to have any issues getting their pelvis open at foot plant, right? These guys are able to open their hips because that's them externally rotating their hips a lot, right? And that range of motion is easier for them. So what the issue ends up becoming is the timing of when they open those hips, right? If they open them up really soon and still get them open, but they open slowly, now they're not sending a lot of force up the chain, and they're probably not going to throw very hard. But these guys are going to be able to get the pelvis open. So if they hold it closed for a really long time as they go down the mound, then it's going to snap open at the end. And now they are getting into a good position at foot plant, and they're doing it quickly, which is going to send a lot of force up the chain. So some examples of this: Ryan Helsley, Shohei Ohtani, Paul Skeens. If you look at the way these guys load in their back hip, all of them kind of hold a vertical shin as they move down, and then they snap those hips open. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, if you are better with internal rotation, you have IR bias, you're going to be able to stay loaded even if your knee caves in. So you're going to struggle if a coach tells you to hold that vertical shin, because that's not really the way your hips work. You don't have that range of motion. But if your knee caves in, which a lot of coaches would deem bad mechanics, you're still going to be able to stay loaded and explode out of that, even though it may not look aesthetically pleasing to them, right? So this is one where you're not going to really struggle keeping your hips closed very long down the mound. So you're going to have to work to get them open a lot of times. Um, and the key with IR bias guys is getting them to really hold tension in their back leg and not lose it on their way down the mound. So a lot of times they have to find an untraditional way to kind of coil up, or do something with their leg kick where they can get some tension and hold that down the mound. Um, but because of the way that their hips work, that's typically not going to be with a vertical shin. A lot of these guys may look like quad dominant, but really that's just their hips finding the optimal pattern for themselves, right? And some examples of this in the big leagues: Edwin Diaz, he's probably my favorite example. Matt Brash is one. Josh Hader is another, right? And these guys, again, all of them throw 100, really good relievers in the big leagues, and they don't move like a typical person, right? This one is a little bit less common than an ER bias. And these guys are able to hold a lot of energy in their back leg, even though it's in a quote unquote untraditional way. But again, they transfer a lot of energy up the chain and can throw hard. As far as levers, believe it or not, you can throw hard with short levers if you're a smaller guy. But what it takes to do that is very good mechanical efficiency. Um, like you got to be big and strong and produce a lot of force. Um, and then you got to be able to transfer that force into the ball through really good sequencing. Um, if you have leaks, it's probably going to be very difficult for you to throw hard just because you don't have the levers helping you out. So you need to produce more force proximally, which means close to the center of mass, right? You got to be able to rotate the hips really fast. You got to be able to get into good positions with your spine. You got to be able to rotate the torso very fast. And then that's going to move distally out to the ball. But for somebody with longer levers, they're going to be able to produce more force out on the ball because the lever is longer. So they need less force, where if you have short levers, you need more force at the proximal close to your body, right? And one thing that people with short levers have a easier time with than people with longer levers is being able to control their center of mass, and be able to really like control how fast they're going down the mound, um, be in good positions while they're moving fast. Those kind of things are things that taller, longer athletes struggle with, but short lever guys are going to be able to do. And a lot of times that leads to better proprioceptive ability, an easier time picking up mechanical cues and learning them. So although there are some cons that come with being a shorter guy and not having those levers, there are also some pros. So it's important that you leverage those. And some notable MLB players that are not necessarily that tall, don't have that long of limbs. I put Marcus Stroman and Tim Lincecum, right? And both these guys have thrown mid upper 90s. And they did it with really good mechanical efficiency, really good body control, and those kind of things. They didn't just try to throw the same as a tall guy. So for the long levers, typically you're going to be able to get more extension, right? Releasing the ball closer to the plate because you have longer legs, longer arms, longer torso. And that is going to help you be more deceptive, right? You're also going to be able to put more force into the ball distally because you have those longer arms, right? So like I said on the last slide, these longer lever guys are going to have to produce less force proximally to be able to produce the same force into the ball. And that's because of how the torques work with having a longer lever arm and being able to accelerate through a longer space. Um, Now, these longer lever guys, a lot of times, especially young guys, it's difficult to control your center of mass. It's difficult to control where your body is in space because you have everything further away from your center of mass. Um, so in general, these longer lever guys, especially when they're younger, are going to have less proprioceptive ability overall, which again can make it more difficult to learn things mechanically, more difficult to make small adjustments. But the trade-off for that, again, is going to be that extension, that ability to typically guys have bigger hands, and longer arms are going to typically help you throw harder. So examples of this, Jacob deGrom, like I used him before, he's a really tall, really lanky guy, and he's able to throw, he's basically sits 100. And then two guys for the Marlins, they're also very tall, very long levers, Sandy Alcantara and Yuri Perez. These guys are able to produce a ton of force into the ball because they have these long levers and they're able to use them properly. So why do all these things matter? Why am I clustering guys into certain groups, right? Your body is designed to move a certain way, and you shouldn't change that. You shouldn't move away from the way that you were designed to move. A lot of times coaches will try to get you to move a certain way because they have seen a big leaguer move that way, or they've heard that that's what they want guys to look like. But if you're not built to do that and you get sent that direction, it's probably going to cause a lot more harm than good. So going along that route, like having comparisons is going to kill you, right? If you compare yourself and you try to just move like big leaguers because they're where you want to be, you're not going to ever move like that, right? Everybody moves a little bit differently. So if you are trying to copy somebody else, you're not moving in your optimal way, right? Your body is going to move in the way it thinks it's best. So make the task simple, right? If you are trying to get your body into a certain position because you watched a video of Aroldis Chapman and you want to move like him, you're going to overthink things. Your body's going to maybe get into one position that he's in, but not all of them, right? Where if you make the task simple of, hey, I'm going to do this drill and I'm going to throw the ball as hard as I can, and I'm throwing a slightly lighter ball, right? Now that's going to force your body to get into whatever position it can do to throw the ball as hard as you can. And that's going to kind of open up your eyes to how your body wants to move, right? And those things can be adjusted, but typically not by just trying to get into a position that somebody else is in, right? And so it matters because you need to be aware of this stuff before you take mechanical advice or make any adjustments. If you just go into it blindly, a lot of times you're going to get led the wrong direction. So it's important to know these things and discuss them with any coaches you have, because if you know you move a certain way, especially if you have evidence of it in the weight room or during mobility drills or things like that, that can really affect how you're going to move on the mound and how you should move on the mound. So overall, you want to use drills that play into your strengths, right? If you're only doing drills that work on weaknesses and go about things the way that you don't like to move, you're missing out on patterning the way your body actually wants to move. So, yes, you should work on things that you're not good at, but you also need to do those in a way that you're moving your body in a manner that it is designed to do it. And in order for you to make the adjustments, you need to understand what kind of athlete you are. Again, if you're just guessing, then sometimes you're going to guess right and you're going to do a drill that clicks, but a lot of times you're going to guess wrong and you're going to move yourself a little bit backwards, right? So you're not going to make progress at the rate you want to, because every time you make a wrong guess, you're wasting reps. Um, and so I wouldn't suggest you trying stuff on your own without guidance. Typically, when you do that, again, you're going to guess wrong and you're going to make mistakes. But if you have a coach that really understands how your body moves, what kind of things you should be working on because of the way your body moves, now you're just not going to be wasting as many reps. You're going to get the most bang for your buck. If any of you guys have questions about any of this or where you fit into a certain category, anything like that, go ahead and drop them here and I will go ahead and answer them. Anything else you guys want to learn mechanically, just let me know. I will drop as many videos as I can about your guys' subjects that you want to know. So appreciate you guys listening through. I will catch you on the next one.